So first off, hi, I'm Leah. And I'll make the hashtag reminder and Twitter and all that good stuff. The information's up there, including my handle. I want to thank everybody and thank the Language Resource Center for inviting me. I'm super delighted to be able to talk about some of the work being done in my courses, especially in a non-architectural context. It's always kind of fun. As far as languages go, English I speak. My Spanish is terrible, but I read data and I speak in maps, and there's a lot of translation going on there, so I'll stick with that. So I was asked to discuss some of the work within a course that I've been developing and teaching over the last couple of years. Before I launch into that specifically, I want to take a moment and situate that work within some of the disciplinary questions that the course grapples with. Primary among those is, of course, I'm going to talk about data visualization, which I do want to emphasize, again, as a sort of translation, right? A process of interpretation and definitely a form of communication. The course's syllabus, and I promise I'll get into it with images and whatnot, describes that spatial data visualization has become a sort of favorite activity within architecture, both in practice and in research, as a tool for analysis, but also as a medium for representation. So now, obviously, I'm immediately regretting not being here and not being able to make it in the morning for David's talk on Lefebvre. So while these two uses, analysis and representation, are intimately linked in pretty much every discipline, they're almost often purely, completely synonymous in architecture. Spatial analysis, the understanding of spatial relationships, organizational mechanisms and patterns, social relations within the city, interactions between users and environments, descriptions of communities, all of these are understood in architecture via the drawing, right, the map or the diagram. Thus, the ways in which we draw the city, including the data we declare representative and how we choose to represent it, has profound effects on what we know of the city, the decisions we make, the policies, and the projects we design, right? So architecture happens in public. We not only have to research, but ultimately it's a mandate of the discipline, we have to then make something. And so architecture happens in public, and as we just saw, often to the public. And so, of course, it behooves us as urban information and informatics proliferate to critically engage all of that information, to contextualize the data sets that emerge within the city and the urban processes that, for better or worse, but usually for better, happen to evade digital monitoring. Behooves us to seek out the informality that tends not to be describable in quantitative terms, reinserting the informal and the social back into our understanding of the city, especially as we continue to describe our urbanism more and more quantitatively. And then lastly, to design ways of seeing the city that are sensitive to its pluralism, right? Even when we're working with digital and quantitative data sets that so often lack plural perspectives. So toward this end, I've been teaching for the last couple of years an undergraduate course that I call Datascapes in the Informal City. And sometimes I just call it Datascapes for short. Fall 2013 is on the top, fall 2014 is on the bottom, but we'll get there. So yeah, Datascapes for short. Very briefly, I'll try to describe this. Datascapes is a special topics seminar within the Barnard and Columbia College's architecture department. So the special topics seminars are hybrid courses. They're run mostly as seminars, except that the student's major project or major work is a design project rather than a written project, written assignment. The seminar engages topics of representation and visualization, systems and sites and scales, information and the public sphere, as well as other rather important issues and implications of informality as a broad concept within, and situating those within discussions of so-called smartness or smart cities, which generally are understood, designed, and theorized as very, very formal, we'll say. In the end, my students are asked to develop visualization projects that challenge the ways in which the city is drawn through its data, and thereby challenging the nature of the data itself. Specifically, the projects must visualize urban phenomena on which we cannot, by definition, gather data. And this is the course's operational definition of the informal. Within the context of the class, we keep a very broad definition here of informality, trying very hard to stay away from assumptions about illegality or illicitness or the illegitimate, and we understand it more as the unformalized, such that it encompasses basically that which is left unquantified, unmeasured, or otherwise unseen or intangible within the growing landscape of urban data. And so my students are tasked with this seemingly impossible task, and they all freak out a little bit, but they get really excited, of visualizing that which is not visible and giving form to that which is not formal, using the most formal and the most quantitative of sources available to them, and doing so through thoughtful and very critical representation. And to do this, the class takes a corridor approach. I just keep piling on the craziness of this class. So the students work they work in groups on separate but adjacent sites through corridors in New York. I've taught it twice, so far we've got 2 different corridors. Believe it or not, on the top you're looking at 120, that's a map of, this is the scale, of 125th Street in Harlem, or across Harlem, through Manhattanville, across Harlem, down to East Harlem, from river to river. On the bottom, again, believe it or not, you're looking at a map of Canal Street. Okay. So, like I said, separate but adjacent sites along corridors. This distinct but connected corridor approach allows for us to have a sort of seminar-wide conversation, but we also can compare and contrast different neighborhoods, but everybody's sort of thinking about the same space of the city, or similar and connected spaces of the city. It also allows us the ability to share data resources amongst the projects, and then getting to compare and contrast the very, very different ways different data sets can be used, and in those differences, look at the way that the representation of that information changes what it means, right? Okay, so yeah. And at the same time, it allows the projects to diverge as necessary and explore different topics as the students wish. It also offers us a chance to raise a few very important questions about neighborhoods more generally, about the extent to which their geography, about the extent to which their boundaries are often unclear and changing, and we've talked about that a little bit. I'll be the 3rd person this afternoon to say that, despite the fact that those neighborhoods seem to have clear delineations on most maps. We also can talk about the extent to which the boundaries by which our data is collected, be it census tracts or blocks or counties or tiny little points that Yelp is pulling together, or who's tweeting what from where, or 311 latitude and longitude coordinates, right? These crazy different ways that the data is actually describing space and the units that it uses may or may not coincide with any of the ways, the geographies in which I think that space is experienced or perceived, depending on, not only on the ground, but also dependent on who you are and the various communities to which you belong, right? And so the corridors have one extra bonus too. It also lets us play out territorial issues and territorial negotiations in a little role play that's not actually a role play, because they actually have something at stake. So again, students work in groups, and each of them are working on a topic of their own choosing. And the kicker here is that their topics are submitted in a written proposal to me prior to them knowing their site, prior to them even having a site. They all know the corridor, so they have something to go on. They all know that these streets span neighborhoods, so they gather together and they think about what they want to study. They start to suss out look for data, gather sources, and then they propose a topic. And then once all of them have a vested interest and really care about where they work, I devote an entire classroom to them hashing out their boundaries themselves. Yes. They negotiate with one another for their territory, and it is an absolutely amazing thing to watch. They're the big ones, right, that somebody definitely wants to deal with sort of, street vending. Every year somebody wants to do a street vending, and they've got a specific part of Canal Street that they need to hit, or a specific part of 125th Street that they need to cover. Sidebar. This, the top and the bottom, it's formal and informal vending on the street. But they get hyper specific, right? And they even, sentences like, you hear them like, quote, but we really need that subway entrance on the other side of the street. Like, just give us, 10 feet into the sidewalk, because there aren't allowed to be any gaps. Anyway, the threat there is that if they can't figure it out by the end of the class period, I will handle land negotiations the way land negotiations get handled, and I will arbitrate. And then nobody will be happy. Okay, so as if all of this weren't enough, I throw in one extra twist. Datascapes as a course asks the students to handle all of these questions, but also to challenge the use of a specific tool or a specific medium. To question that tool's relationship to information more broadly, and think about the role digital technologies generally play now in our analysis and our design methods, right? To question the ways that tool or that medium is usually deployed specifically in architecture, but also in public, as more of these become accessible technologies. And to lastly, to question that medium's relationship to its audience. So, in Harlem, they were required to use rapid prototyping and 3D printing. And on Canal Street, they were required to use online interactive web mapping as a medium. I will be teaching it again next fall, and I don't know yet what that requirement will be. Okay, so I do want to say, before I start jumping into projects, that there are no prerequisites for this course. They get a crash course in GIS, they get a crash course in understanding open data, reading metadata, figuring out what's reliable, what's trustworthy. They all have to learn basic sort of geographic analysis concepts like the modifiable aerial unit problem. For my non-architecture students, they all have to learn the standards and the conventions of architectural representation. Most of them have never taken a cartography class, so they learn those as well. When we were 3D printing, they learned 3D digital modeling and then, of course, 3D printing. None of my students in the most recent iteration knew much about interactive mapping, so there was a little bit of that, there was a little bit of coding. They walk away with tons of just technical skills, but more importantly, situated in a sort of, we discuss it in a context where they have to critique those skills, right? And you can't just take them as they are. None of this, including the information, is raw or unbiased. All of it needs to be interpreted. So I'll go through a couple, and then I'm going to jump to the website. I'm going to go through a couple images and talk about a couple projects from the first iteration, and then show a few from the second. What you're looking at here is a sort of close-up photograph that I've annotated in yellow. The project was done by two students, Dare Brawley and Emily Tobin. They looked at the spatial distribution of systemic barriers to homeownership, or attempted to understand this through visualization and making something that not only communicated with an audience what they were dealing with, but helped them sort out some difficult issues as well. The datum of the street in this iteration, all of the students decided that street level was going to be 6 inches off the ground so that they could be aligned, right? Because context matters. Okay. So, so the datum of the street serves here to separate individually lot-sized volumes above and below that datum. They effectively removed rental units out of the equation, right? Because they're thinking about home ownership by submerging them underground, so they're hanging underneath. And the volume left above is essentially a quantity representing the availability of the opportunity for homeownership. Carved away from that mass volumetrically is a sort of quantitative representation of those barriers to homeownership, which they understood as an index that they compiled that combined several different sort of income indicators and demographics, as well as home mortgage disclosure data on the number of, both the number of mortgage applications denied, but also the reasons and how those are sort of distributed. So topically, what they were ultimately able to speak about through the visualization were interactions between land use and economic opportunity that are very rarely easily described. Methodologically, what they wrestled with were the effects of both authoritative and experiential boundaries, as well as the legacies of sort of data-driven descriptions of the city. Of course, also included projects, there we go, that compares the formal and informal retail activity on the street. On the bottom, you've got sort of formal, what the students called formal, so established brick and mortar, immobile, we'll say, vendors. And on the top, you're looking at a density representation of street vendors on the sidewalk, and they did field work. They collected point locations through observation at a number of different times. This one, incidentally, in order to sort of interact with an audience and recognize that there isn't necessarily one way to look at this problem, it does spin. And one side's heavier. Okay. They've got another one that looked at neighborhood change and gentrification as a comparison of the number of years since the building permits were issued per building. So that's moving downward from here. Basically, this layer serves as a map of their study area. And then by individual building, the number of years since a building permit was issued for renovation or other sort of building work. You're also looking at, and then the density of observed graffiti in the neighborhood versus the density of 311 complaints about graffiti. We also had one more that looked at access to sexual health resources, described as both sort of a combination and intersection of educational programming and condom availability. I'm going to start talking faster. Okay. In each, the topical challenge was to sort of understand and describe the informal and the dynamic as a series of spatialized relationships and interactions within the city, and to thoughtfully consider how the representational choices define how the city itself is understood. The analytical challenges then included reconciling differences between different data sets and sources, as well as different methods and the medium that was mandated to them, as well as the relationship between the data, its interpretation, that is the way in which we interpret via visualization, and the intended audience. All the same is true for the interactive map projects as well, and I'm going to look at a few of them very fast, but those are all easily online for you guys to play with, because again, the work has to be in public. So it's cool.barnard.edu/datascapes. The awesome people at IMATS agreed to make me a website so the students had somewhere to put the work. Very quickly, one group, I'm going to actually zoom into their legend, that versus the map, to show you how much they did and how they felt I sort of were able to conquer the idea of zooming. Now, with each successive level of zoom, right, moving inward and inward, different pieces of information are shown, because what you can sort of perceive, they're trying to discuss issues of disorientation. So what you can perceive at different zoom levels reflects sort of limitations of our perception and limitations of the data, one sort of at a time. So it's a rather complex legend. Back up. And I'll end on this one, actually. You guys can all play if you want. If you pay attention to the legend up in the top here, this pair of students is looking at the far east side of Canal Street, and they're looking at demographic or ethnic makeup of immigrants over time through history of this neighborhood, and as well as the ethnic ownership of businesses. And one thing that was rather insightful, they also decided to challenge the ways in which we understand zooming by playing with the relationship between space and time. And here, every time you zoom, you actually move backward in time as you zoom out. The legend updates telling you where you are, or when you are, rather. And this accomplished several things for them, not the least of which meant that they could really engage the level to which different data sources have sort of, they have different levels of reliability and accuracy. It isn't, for many of our historic sources, they don't have the sort of fidelity or resolution to be meaningful up close. And statistics are aggregated in different ways, so they can sort of take advantage of that rather than letting it be limiting. So we zoom out in time, and then we zoom back in time. With that, I will switch back and say thanks.